I was 36 when I bought the cabin. It was never part of the plan. I had no dreams of escaping the city or living off the grid. I worked a regular job in Cleveland, and I liked my routine. But after my divorce, I needed space. My life felt like a series of mistakes stacked on top of each other, and I just wanted to be left alone. I found the listing late one night while I was half drunk and scrolling through properties I had no business buying. It was deep in the Appalachian woods, about 20 miles from any town, with no paved road leading to it. The photos were terrible, grainy shots of a wooden structure with a rusted tin roof, an overgrown yard, and a thick forest pressing in from all sides. But the price was ridiculously low. It took me less than a week to make up my mind. I withdrew most of my savings, signed the paperwork, and packed up my truck. I told myself it was just temporary, 6 months, maybe a year. Enough time to get my head straight, fix up the place, and then sell it for a profit. The first few weeks were quiet, peaceful even. I spent my mornings chopping wood, patching up the leaks in the roof, and clearing out the junk left behind by the previous owner. The place had been abandoned for years. Dust covered everything. I found old furniture, hunting gear, and stacks of newspapers from the early 2000s. At night, the quiet was different. Not peaceful, just empty. I wasn't used to silence. Back in the city, there was always background noise, cars, sirens, people. Out here, the only sounds came from the woods. Wind moving through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, sometimes the sharp cry of an animal in the dark. Then, there were the noises I couldn't explain. First, it was small things, footsteps crunching in the leaves outside, the creak of wood, like someone shifting their weight on the porch. I told myself it was animals, deer, maybe a bear, but then I started noticing other things. The first real sign was the door. One morning, I woke up to find my front door cracked open, just an inch or two, enough to let the cold air in. I knew I had locked it the night before. I double-checked it every night along with the windows. I searched the cabin from top to bottom. Nothing was missing, no signs of forced entry. I convinced myself I had made a mistake. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. I pushed it out of my head. A few days later, I found footprints in the dirt outside. Human footprints. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider with a heavy heel. They led from the tree line to my porch and then back into the woods. I stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker had wandered through, maybe a hunter, but why come all the way to my cabin? Why walk up to the porch and then leave? I started locking the door with a chair wedged under the handle at night. I kept my rifle close. Then, things got worse. One night, I woke up to a sound inside the cabin, a soft shuffle, like someone shifting their weight on the wooden floor. I stayed still, barely breathing. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached for the rifle beside my bed and gripped it tight. I listened. Nothing. After what felt like an hour, I finally worked up the courage to get up. I moved through the cabin slowly, checking every corner. The door was still locked, the windows shut. Nothing was out of place, but I knew what I had heard. I started sleeping in short bursts, always half awake, listening. I kept the rifle loaded, safety off. Then one night I saw him. It was just past midnight. I had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside my window. I turned my head, barely breathing. Through the thin curtain, I saw the shadow of a man. Tall, broad shoulders, standing completely still, facing the cabin. I gripped my rifle so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't move. The shadow stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I grabbed my boots and went outside. The ground was damp from last night's rain. I found his tracks easily. They led from the tree line to my window, then back into the woods. I followed them. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could scare him off. Maybe I just wanted answers. The tracks wound through the trees, deeper into the forest. I followed them for over an hour. Then they just stopped. No signs of turning around. No broken branches. Nothing. Like he had vanished. I hiked back to the cabin, heart pounding. I packed my bags. I loaded my truck. I was done. I didn't care about selling the place. I didn't care about the money I had put into it. I just wanted to leave. By noon, I was on the road, heading west. I didn't stop until I hit Ohio. I never went back. A few weeks later, I got a call from the real estate agent handling the cabin. She sounded confused. The new buyer found something in the woods, she said. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. But before she hung up, she told me anyway. An old hunting cabin, she said, about a mile from yours. It was falling apart. No one's been in it for years. Then, after a pause, they found bones inside. I ended the call. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want the answers. I never liked driving at night, especially in the rain. The headlights cut through the downpour, the wipers working overtime, but the dark countryside pressed in on both sides of the narrow road. I had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to creep into my bones. The plan was simple: spend a few nights at my uncle's old cabin, take a break from the noise of the city, clear my head. He hadn't used it in years, but he told me the key would be under a loose brick near the porch. It was a quiet spot deep in the woods, a place he used to go hunting back in the day. I finally spotted the turnoff, nearly missing it in the rain. The road leading to the cabin was just a dirt path, made worse by the storm. My truck's tires sank into the mud, and I kept a steady grip on the wheel, hoping I wouldn't get stuck. After about 10 minutes, the headlights picked up the outline of the cabin through the trees. It was small, weathered, and isolated, exactly what I needed. I parked and stepped out, pulling my jacket tight against the cold rain. The wind howled through the trees, sending a deep chill through me. I found the loose brick near the porch, just as my uncle had said, and retrieved the old key. It took a little force to get the door open, but once I did, the musty smell of old wood and dust greeted me. The inside was exactly what I expected: basic furniture, a small wood-burning stove, a single bed in the corner. There was an old generator out back, but I decided to settle in before messing with it. I set my bags down, grabbed a flashlight, and checked the pantry. A few canned goods were left behind, some hunting knives on a rack, and a rifle leaning against the wall. The windows were boarded up from the inside, but some of the wood was warped and splitting. The rain hammered the roof as I went out back to start the generator. Took a few tries, but eventually it rumbled to life. Dim yellow light flickered on inside the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I locked the door behind me and pulled off my wet clothes, changing into something dry. For the first time all day, I let myself relax. I should have known it wouldn't last. The first strange thing happened that night. I had barely drifted off to sleep when a noise woke me, something moving outside. I lay there for a moment, listening. The wind was still howling, the rain still falling, but I could hear something else beneath it. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the wet leaves. I sat up, heart pounding. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the nearest window. The boards blocked most of the view, but through a gap, I could see the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual. Still, something didn't feel right. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray. I went outside to look around. The dirt around the cabin had turned to thick mud, and something caught my eye. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare feet. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows. The mud was disturbed right where I had stood behind the glass, meaning whoever had been out here had been watching me. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the unease. Maybe a hunter got lost out here. Maybe someone was looking for shelter from the storm. That's what I told myself. I spent the rest of the day chopping wood, fixing one of the broken window boards and checking the rifle. The cabin was isolated, but it wasn't abandoned. Someone knew I was here, and they had come close. That night, I made sure the door was locked and kept the rifle within reach. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside had me on edge, but by the early morning hours, exhaustion won again. Then I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was close, right outside the cabin wall. Slow, measured breaths like someone standing just beyond the boards, listening. I didn't move. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. And then came the slow, dragging sound of something running along the cabin's exterior. Fingernails? A stick? I didn't know, but it made my skin crawl. And then the doorknob rattled. I grabbed the rifle and sat up, heart hammering against my ribs. The door didn't budge. It was locked, but the rattling continued, harder this time. I flicked on my flashlight and pointed it at the door. Silence. I stayed like that, sitting in bed, rifle in my lap, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks. The rain had stopped completely by morning, but the ground was still soft. When I stepped outside, I saw them immediately. More footprints, bare, deep prints circling the cabin, stopping at the door, the windows. Whoever it was had stood right outside while I slept. Then I saw something else. The footprints didn't come from the main road or the forest trail. They came from deeper in the woods, from a direction I hadn't explored yet. I made a decision. Grabbing my rifle, I followed them. The tracks led me through thick trees, over dead leaves and tangled roots. The deeper I went, the more I regretted it. The woods were silent. No birds, no rustling, just dead quiet. Then I saw it, an old shack nearly hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, but the footprints led straight to its door. Something told me to turn back, but I had to know. I stepped forward and peered through a crack in the wood. Inside was a pile of old blankets, empty food cans, and a rusted knife stuck in a tree stump. Someone had been living here, and they had been watching me. I didn't go back to the cabin. I turned around, walked straight to my truck, and drove away without looking back. I left everything behind, the bags, the food, even the rifle. I didn't care. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. A week later, my uncle called. He had gone up to check on the cabin. He asked if I had boarded up the windows before I left. I told him I hadn't. He said someone had, and inside the rifle was gone. I never went back. I lived alone in a cabin deep in the forests of northern Montana. It wasn't a choice made out of necessity, but rather a preference. I liked my solitude. The trees were my company, and the quiet was my peace. The cabin was something I built myself about 15 years ago. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy wooden structure. One main room with a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen setup, and a loft above for sleeping. No running water, no electricity. I had a well a few yards away for water, and a generator I used sparingly for power. Propane tanks kept my stove going, but I cooked over the fire most days. I hunted my own food, trapped when I needed to, and lived off the land as much as possible. It wasn't easy, but it was the life I chose. There were no real roads leading to my place, just a narrow, overgrown dirt path that I could take with my old truck if I absolutely had to. Most of the time, I left the truck parked a few miles away near a logging road and walked in. It was safer that way, less chance of people stumbling onto my cabin by accident. But one winter, something happened that made me rethink everything. It was early December, just before the real heavy snows started rolling in. The days were short, the nights long, and the cold settled deep into the bones of the forest. I had spent most of the day splitting wood and stacking it against the side of the cabin, making sure I had enough to last me through the coldest months. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, I was sore and tired, ready to settle in for the night. I ate a simple meal, deer meat I had dried and some boiled roots, then sat by the stove, warming my hands over the crackling fire. I was just about ready to turn in when I heard it. A single, distant snap of a branch. It wasn't the sound itself that bothered me. Branches broke all the time, animals moved through the trees, the wind knocked things over. But this one was different, too sharp, too deliberate, like a footstep. I stood up and listened, staring at the door. The fire crackled behind me, filling the room with flickering light, but outside, the forest was a black void. Then another snap. Closer this time. I had a rifle, always kept it within reach, leaning against the wall near my bed. I moved toward it now, picking it up with slow, careful movements. My heart wasn't racing yet, but my senses were sharpening, tuning into the quiet outside. I walked to the window, looking out. Nothing, just the trees, shadows stretching long under the moonlight. I waited, breathing slow. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. Maybe it was a deer, maybe a fox, maybe nothing at all. I went to bed, but I kept the rifle next to me. Morning came cold and pale. I stepped outside, breath fogging in the frigid air, and looked around. The forest was still, silent in the way it always was in the early hours. But when I looked down near the tree line, I saw them. Tracks, not deer, not wolf, boot prints. I crouched, looking closer. They were fresh, pressed deep into the frozen dirt. They came from the north, moved toward the cabin, then stopped. No sign of them leaving. I stood, scanning the trees. The woods were dense in that direction, thick with underbrush. Whoever had been here could still be watching. I walked the perimeter of my cabin, checking for more tracks. Found a few near the back where my well was. Whoever it was had been close, too close. I went inside, locked the door. I wasn't the only one out here. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I kept the fire low, trying to keep the glow from escaping through the windows. Every now and then, I'd hear something. A faint rustle, the crack of a twig, but nothing ever came close again. Then, on the 4th night, I woke up to something new. Not a sound, a smell. Rot. I sat up in my loft, sniffing the air. It was faint, but it was there. Something sour, something decaying, like old meat left out too long. I grabbed my rifle, climbed down the ladder, and moved to the window. The moon was out, casting a pale glow over the snow-dusted ground. First, I didn't see anything. Then, just at the edge of the trees, something hanging. I grabbed my lantern, threw on my coat, and stepped outside. The cold hit me hard, cutting through my clothes, but I ignored it. I walked toward the tree line, rifle ready. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A deer carcass, strung up by its back legs. But this wasn't from a hunter. It had been cut open, its insides missing, its head turned toward my cabin. Like a warning, I stood there for a long time, breath clouding the air. Someone was out here. Someone who wanted me to know they were out here. I cut the deer down, dragged it away, and buried it under a pile of snow. Then I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire with my rifle in my lap. I don't know why I fell asleep, but I did. Maybe exhaustion, maybe just my body giving out after days of tension. But when I woke up, it wasn't to a noise. It was to the smell. Inside the cabin, I bolted upright, reaching for my rifle. The fire was low, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. And then I saw him, a figure standing in the far corner, half hidden in the dark. I raised the rifle, finger on the trigger. The figure didn't move. For a long moment, neither of us did. Then he took a step forward. The firelight hit his face. Ragged clothes, hollow cheeks, a grin too wide for his face. I didn't hesitate. I fired. The blast shattered the quiet, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The figure stumbled, let out a sound, half a grunt, half a laugh, and then lunged. I fired again. He fell. The silence after was deafening. My ears rang. The only sound was my own breath, ragged, uneven. I stepped closer, rifle still raised. The man wasn't dead. Not yet. He was still breathing, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading. He looked up at me. His lips moved. No words, just a smile, wide and empty. I shot him again. This time, he didn't get back up. I burned the body, dragged it out into the woods, doused it in kerosene, and watched the flames rise. The smell was awful, but I didn't stop. I didn't let myself think. When the fire died down, I covered what was left in snow and left it there. The next morning, I packed up what I could and left. I never went back to that cabin. Some places, I learned, aren't meant to be lived in. Some places, no matter how deep in the woods, aren't empty. I should have called it off when I saw the weather forecast, but I had already put too much time into planning this job. My boss needed the cabin finished before winter, and I was the only one available to work that week. It was supposed to be a quick solo job, just a couple of nights up in the woods, working late, getting things done. I had done plenty of builds like this before, and I wasn't worried about a little bad weather. The site was tucked deep in the forest, at least an hour's drive from the nearest town. The dirt roads leading there were rough, full of potholes and uneven patches, and after it rained, they turned into a muddy mess. I left early in the morning, loaded up my truck with tools, extra lumber, and supplies, and started the drive out there. By the time I reached the site, the sky was already overcast. Thick gray clouds hung low over the trees, and the smell of rain was in the air. The cabin itself was mostly framed, walls were up, the foundation was solid, and the roof was partially finished. It was still far from done, though. No doors, no windows yet, just an open structure sitting in the middle of the woods. I got to work right away, not wanting to waste any daylight. I started cutting planks, securing beams, working on the walls. The sound of my hammer echoed through the trees, sharp and hollow. I liked working alone, but something about that silence between hammer strikes felt off. The woods were too quiet. As the afternoon went on, the first drops of rain started falling. I ignored it and kept working, but before long, it turned into a steady downpour. My clothes were soaked, my hands stiff from the cold. The roof wasn't done, so there wasn't much shelter. I grabbed a tarp from my truck and stretched it over part of the frame, trying to make a dry spot to store my tools. It wasn't long before the ground turned to thick, sticky mud. Walking around the site became a struggle, boots sinking with every step. The rain made everything harder. My grip on the hammer, the weight of the wood, the visibility through the dimming light. Still, I kept going. I had a job to finish. By the time night fell, I had managed to get the last of the exterior walls up. The inside of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from my truck's headlights. I was drenched, covered in mud, exhausted. My plan had been to sleep in the truck, but the idea of cramming myself into the small cab, wet and miserable, wasn't appealing. The unfinished cabin had enough of a structure to keep some of the rain out, so I decided to sleep there instead. I set up my sleeping bag in the driest corner I could find, threw a tarp over myself, and tried to get some rest. The rain hammered against the wood, the wind pushing through the gaps in the walls. It was cold. My clothes were still wet, and every gust of wind cut straight through me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The rain was still coming down hard, the wind still howling through the trees. But something felt off. I stayed still, listening. There was another sound, one that didn't belong. Footsteps, not the heavy thuds of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps in the mud outside the cabin. I held my breath. The rain made it hard to tell how close they were, but they were definitely there, moving around the site, stopping, then starting again. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the open doorway. Nothing, just rain and trees, but the feeling didn't go away. I sat there, heart pounding, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers hurt. I told myself it was nothing, just the sound of rain playing tricks on my ears, the wind shifting branches, my own nerves making me hear things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the tarp tighter around me, trying to ignore the way my pulse was hammering in my ears. The night dragged on, every sound amplified by the dark. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and muddy. The forest was still, wrapped in a thick fog. I climbed out of my sleeping bag, stretching my sore muscles, trying to shake the unease from the night before. And then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, deep footprints in the mud outside the cabin. Not mine. Someone had been there. I stood frozen, staring at the tracks. They led from the tree line, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach turned. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been out there, walking around while I slept, watching me. I packed up my things fast, barely stopping to eat. I wanted to get the job done and get out of there. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. By the afternoon, I had finished the last of what I could do alone. I loaded my tools into the truck, glancing one last time at the cabin. I wasn't coming back, not alone. The drive back was slow, the road still slick from the rain. My mind kept going over the footprints, the feeling of being watched, the silence of the woods. I didn't tell my boss what had happened, just said the job was done. A week later, he sent another guy out to check on the site. He called me after, said the cabin had been broken into, said there were more footprints, and this time they led inside. I never went back. I was never supposed to be there. The cabin was old, abandoned, and completely off any main road. It wasn't on any maps I could find, not even the topographical ones I used for hiking. The forest around it was dense, too dense. It swallowed the little wooden structure whole, making it seem like the trees were closing in, suffocating it. I hadn't planned on finding it. I had just been out for a weekend of hiking in the backwoods, trying to disconnect from everything. It had been a rough year, and I needed the solitude. The first night, I set up camp near a small creek, cooked some canned beans, and fell asleep under a sky choked with clouds. By the second day, things went wrong. I had been following my map carefully, but somehow, I got turned around. The trees started looking the same, the trails I thought I was following disappeared, and my compass seemed unreliable. I wasn't worried at first. I had been in the woods plenty of times before, and I knew how to handle myself. But by the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I was still wandering in circles. That's when I saw it. The cabin was small, barely more than a shack. The wood was dark with rot. The windows were either shattered or covered in grime, and the roof sagged in the middle. It looked like no one had been there for decades. At first, I thought about walking past it. I could find my own way out in the morning, I told myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't have much choice. My water supply was running low, and the night air was getting colder than I had expected. I didn't want to sleep outside again, not when there was shelter right in front of me. I stepped up to the door and gave it a small push. It groaned on its hinges but didn't resist. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of damp wood. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark like a knife. There wasn't much to see. A broken table, some chairs missing legs, a fireplace choked with old ash. Everything was coated in grime. Then I saw the trapdoor. It was in the middle of the floor, partially hidden under an old rug. My heart started beating faster. There was no reason for a place like this to have a basement. Cabins this deep in the woods didn't need one. People who built them wanted simplicity, not underground rooms. But there it was, a thick wooden door with a rusted metal handle. I should have left. I should have ignored it and just slept in a corner until morning. But I didn't. Pulled it open. The smell hit me first. A thick, rotten stench that filled my lungs and made my stomach twist. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I aimed it down into the darkness. A set of old wooden stairs led into the basement, disappearing into the shadows below. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Then I started down. The basement was small, maybe the size of a single room. The walls were stone, damp with moisture. My flashlight beam swept across the space, and then it landed on it. The body. At first, I thought it was just a pile of old clothes. But as I got closer, I realized how wrong I was. The skin was stretched tight over the bones, dried out and discolored. The hands were curled inward, fingers frozen in a claw-like grip. The mouth was open, as if the person had been screaming when they died. My heart slammed in my chest. I had seen dead animals before, deer, birds, even a bear carcass once. But this was different. This was human. I forced myself to look closer. The clothes were tattered but still intact. A flannel shirt, ripped jeans, no shoes. The way the body was positioned, it looked like they had crawled to that spot and just stopped moving. My flashlight caught something else. Marks on the stone floor, deep scratches, like fingernails. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the nausea building in my throat. Someone had tried to claw their way out of here. I backed up, my breathing shallow. My mind raced through possibilities. Who was this? How long had they been here? Was it an accident? No, couldn't have been. There were no doors down here, no other way in or out. Whoever this was, they had been put down here. I turned and ran up the stairs, almost tripping over my own feet. The moment I got back into the cabin, I slammed the trapdoor shut and stumbled back, my chest heaving. I had to get out. I had to leave now. But as I turned toward the door, something caught my eye. The dust. The floor was covered in a thick layer of it, except for one spot. A single set of footprints. Not mine. Someone else had been here. Recently. A fresh bolt of fear shot through me. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body felt frozen. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was walking around the cabin. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I barely even breathed. The footsteps moved closer, crunching over twigs and leaves. Then they stopped, right at the door. A long silence stretched out. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel someone standing there, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in the dark. Seconds, minutes, felt like hours. Then, finally, the footsteps started again. Slow, steady, moving away from the cabin. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and bolted. I ran through the woods, barely able to see where I was going. My heart pounded, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't care if I was going the wrong way. I just needed to get away. At some point, I found the road. I don't remember how. I barely even remember making it back to my truck. I just know I never looked back. I called the cops once I got to town, told them everything. They sent a team out there, found the cabin, found the body. But the footprints, the sounds I heard, they found nothing. They told me it must have been an animal. Maybe I imagined the footsteps. Maybe fear made me hear things. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know someone else was out there. Somewhere in those woods, whoever locked that person in that basement was still out there. And they knew I had been there too. I took the hunting trip alone that year. It wasn't my first time going solo, but it was my first time staying in that particular cabin. My usual spot was a bit closer to town, but the landowner had sold it, and the new guy didn't allow hunters. So I had to find somewhere else. An old friend from work mentioned this place. Deep in the woods, a few miles past the nearest trail, far enough from any roads or houses that no one would bother me. He'd stayed there once years ago and said it was perfect for a quiet trip. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just a roof over my head and a place to rest between long hours in the forest. I drove out early in the morning, packed with enough supplies for a week. My rifle, ammo, camping gear, and food filled the truck bed. It was late autumn, just cold enough that I could see my breath, but not quite winter yet. The trees were mostly bare, the ground covered in fallen leaves. The road leading out there was barely a road, more like a dirt path that had been forgotten years ago. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks as I got deeper into the woods. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already slipping lower in the sky. The place looked like no one had been there in years. It wasn't much, just a small wooden structure with a slanted roof, a porch with a couple of broken chairs, and a door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it was simple. A cot in the corner, a rusted wood stove, a shelf with old canned goods that I didn't trust, and a small table with one chair. Dust covered everything. I spent the first hour cleaning up, sweeping out leaves and dirt, stacking firewood by the stove. The place smelled musty, like damp wood and old metal, but it would do. The door had a simple latch, and the windows were grimy but intact. After unloading my gear, I walked the perimeter, checking for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of place, just an abandoned hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere. I set up a small fire outside and cooked dinner, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, too quiet. I should have heard owls, the rustling of small animals, something. But there was nothing. Just the distant sound of the wind moving through the trees. That first night, I barely slept. The cot was uncomfortable, and every little noise put me on edge. At one point, I was sure I heard something moving outside, slow, deliberate steps crunching through the leaves. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Then silence, just the wind again. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Long days alone in the woods can make a person hear things that aren't there. By the next morning, I was ready to hunt. I hiked deep into the forest, following tracks and watching the trees. I found signs of deer, fresh tracks in the dirt, claw marks on bark where bucks had scraped their antlers. I followed them for hours, rifle in hand, moving carefully, listening. The woods felt different here. I'd hunted plenty of times before, but something about this place made me uneasy. As the sun started to dip, I realized I had wandered further than I meant to. I hadn't seen a single animal all day, not even a squirrel. No birds, no movement, just trees and silence. Then, As I turned to head back, I saw something in the distance, a shape standing between the trees. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't an animal. At first, I thought it was just a tree, the way the shadows played tricks on the eyes. But then it moved, just a small shift, like someone leaning slightly. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring, gripping my rifle tight. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just empty forest. My mind ran through explanations, maybe another hunter, maybe a trick of the light. But I didn't believe either. I made my way back to the cabin as fast as I could without outright running. That night, I locked the door. I checked the windows twice. I kept my rifle close. Sleep didn't come easy. At some point in the night, I woke up suddenly, like my body had sensed something before my brain did. I lay still, listening. Footsteps, not heavy, not loud, but deliberate. Someone, something, was moving outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, my breath shallow. The sound moved around the cabin, circling, leaves crunching. Then, just outside the door, it stopped. Silence. I gripped my rifle, waiting. Then, tap, tap, tap. Not a knock. Just the lightest tapping against the wood, like fingertips brushing over it. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I searched the area. I expected footprints in the dirt, something to prove what I'd heard. But there was nothing, just undisturbed ground, the same as before. I should have left then, should have packed up and driven out. But I told myself it was just nerves, just my mind playing tricks. I spent the next day hunting again, trying to ignore the unease that followed me. But the woods were wrong. Every time I stopped walking, I felt like something was watching me. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement between the trees, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. That night, I locked the cabin up tighter than before. Sometime after midnight, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, but this time it wasn't just one set. I could hear multiple, slow and careful, moving through the leaves, circling. I sat up, rifle aimed at the door, barely breathing. Then, scratching. Long, slow, deliberate scratches against the wood. I had enough. I stood, threw open the door, and aimed my rifle into the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still, empty, but the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my rifle tight. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my gear. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I didn't care about the hunt. I just wanted to leave. I loaded my truck in record time, keeping my eyes on the tree line the whole time. I felt exposed, vulnerable. As I climbed into the driver's seat, something caught my eye. On the cabin wall, carved deep into the wood, were marks. Not scratches, not animal claws. Words, "Don't come back." I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the truck in drive and didn't look back. I never told anyone what happened, never explained why I never hunted there again. But I never went back, and I never will. I remember the last time I saw my cousin Matthew alive. It was the summer of 2014, and we had planned a trip to our family's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. The place had been in the family for decades, built by my grandfather and his brothers long before I was born. It was isolated, miles from the nearest paved road, sitting at the edge of a lake surrounded by dense pine forest. No cell service, no internet, just a small wooden structure with a fireplace, a few cots, and a shed out back with an old generator that barely worked. Matthew and I had grown up together, spending countless summers at the cabin, fishing, hunting, and telling stories by the fire. As kids, we had always imagined the woods were filled with dangers. Bears, wolves, maybe even something worse. But the real danger, I learned that summer, didn't come from the wild. It started as a normal trip. We arrived in the afternoon, unpacked our gear, and went straight to the lake to fish. The water was calm, the sky overcast, and the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. We spent hours out there, catching a few smallmouth bass, drinking beer, and reminiscing about old times. The first night, we built a fire outside, cooked some of the fish, and stayed up late, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. The second day, we decided to do some hunting. The area was known for its deer population, and we had brought our rifles along for the trip. We spent most of the morning tracking, moving slowly through the trees, stopping occasionally to listen for movement. By noon, we hadn't had any luck, so we headed back to the cabin for lunch. That was when things started feeling off. When we got back, the door to the cabin was open. I knew for a fact we had closed it when we left. Not locked, there was no real reason to, but definitely shut. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed. Our bags were still there, our rifles still leaning against the wall. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. Matthew laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind. I wanted to believe that, but the air was dead still that day. No wind, no breeze, just the heavy, suffocating quiet of the forest. We spent the rest of the day near the cabin, keeping an eye on the woods. Every so often, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a flicker of shadow, the quick dart of something just out of sight. Each time I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I told myself it was my imagination, but I kept my rifle close anyway. That night, it rained. A heavy, relentless downpour that pounded against the roof and turned the dirt around the cabin into thick mud. We stayed inside, playing cards by lantern light, drinking more than we should have. Outside, the rain masked all other sounds, making it impossible to hear if anything or anyone was moving in the woods. At some point, Matthew got up to use the outhouse. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the rain, leaving me alone in the cabin. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for him to come back. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. I stood up, grabbed my rifle, and stepped out onto the porch. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air thick with mist. The outhouse door was closed, the flashlight beam faintly visible through a crack in the wood. I called his name. No response. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking into the mud as I made my way toward the outhouse. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my grip tight on the rifle. I reached the door, hesitated for a second, then yanked it open. Empty. The flashlight was on the floor, shining up at the ceiling. There was no sign of Matthew, no footprints leading away, just the flashlight still on, as if he had dropped it mid-step. I turned back toward the cabin, scanning the trees. The mist made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction, but something didn't feel right. The door to the cabin was open again. I was certain I had closed it when I came out. I raised my rifle, heart hammering against my ribs. Then I saw it. A figure standing just inside the doorway. Tall, broad-shouldered, completely still. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to fire, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, out onto the porch, and in that moment, I knew two things. One, it wasn't Matthew. Two, I wasn't alone in those woods. The next few seconds were a blur. I remember raising my rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. The figure moved fast, faster than I thought possible. And suddenly, it was gone, disappearing into the mist like a shadow. I ran to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it, as if that flimsy wooden latch would keep whatever was out there from getting in. I grabbed my lantern, scanning the room. The inside looked the same, but I knew someone had been in there. The air smelled different, like damp clothes and sweat. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, made my skin crawl. I kept my rifle in my hands, my back against the wall, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning, the rain had stopped. The mist had lifted, but Matthew was still gone. I searched for hours, following the faintest disturbances in the underbrush, calling his name until my throat was raw. No tracks, no sign of struggle. It was like he had just vanished. I stayed another night hoping, praying that he would come back. He didn't. The next morning, I packed my things and hiked back to my truck. The drive to town felt longer than usual, my mind replaying everything over and over. I told the police what happened. They searched the woods, sent dogs, even brought in helicopters. Nothing. No body.
No footprints.
No sign that he had ever been there. They questioned me for hours, and I could tell they didn't believe me. Maybe they thought I had something to do with it. Maybe they just thought I was crazy. I went back to the cabin a few weeks later, hoping for some kind of closure. But when I got there, something was different. The cabin door was open again, and inside, on the table, was Matthew's flashlight, still on. I was working a job in the United Kingdom, helping an old friend of mine restore a remote cabin deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for years, tucked away in an area where people rarely passed through. It was one of those places you wouldn't know existed unless someone took you there. The cabin belonged to my friend's uncle, who had bought the land decades ago but never did much with it. Now, my friend had plans to fix it up, maybe rent it out or use it as a getaway spot. He had asked me to come along and help with the work, offering me a decent payment and a place to stay for the time being. I had nothing else lined up at the moment, so I agreed. The drive out there was long. The further I got from the main roads, the more isolated it became. By the time I reached the entrance to the property, it was late afternoon. The sky was overcast, the trees swaying under a cold breeze. The place looked exactly like what I had expected. A rundown wooden structure with a sagging roof and overgrown grass swallowing the front steps. I parked my truck and took a moment to take it all in. The woods surrounded the cabin on all sides, thick and dense, making it feel like I had stepped into a different world. There were no signs of modern life. No distant traffic, no power lines, just silence and the occasional rustling of branches. I grabbed my bag from the truck and walked up to the door. The key my friend had given me worked, but the door needed a good shove to open. Inside, the air was stale, dust coated everything, and a faint smell of damp wood lingered. There was an old couch, a wooden table, and a few chairs, all covered with sheets. The fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in years. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking, sweeping the floors and airing the place out. The more I moved around, the more I felt like something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. I was used to being around people, noise, movement. Here, there was none of that, just silence. That night, I sat by the small fire I had made, eating a sandwich and going over the work I had to do. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees. The dim light from the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar setting. That was until I stepped outside to relieve myself and saw something that made my skin crawl. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a woman. She was far enough that I couldn't make out her face, but close enough that I knew she was staring right at me. She wasn't moving, just standing there. I froze, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she lived nearby. But the way she stood there, motionless, silent, made me doubt both of those possibilities. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look, but the second I moved, she turned and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long time listening, but heard nothing. No footsteps, no breaking branches, just the wind. I convinced myself that I had imagined it. The light from the fire inside could have played tricks on my eyes. That had to be it. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding, ears straining. But nothing happened. The next morning, I forced myself to push the incident aside. I had work to do. I spent most of the day repairing sections of the roof, patching up holes, fixing broken floorboards. The physical labor helped keep my mind occupied. By the time the sun started setting, I was exhausted. I had just finished cleaning up when I noticed something out of place. Footprints in the dirt just outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were smaller, barefoot, leading from the trees to the cabin and then back again. I stood there, staring at them, my stomach twisting into knots. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. I went inside and locked the door again. This time, I barricaded it with one of the chairs. That night, I barely moved from the couch. I kept the fire going, listening, waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something creaking outside. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Then, a tap on the window. It was faint, almost like it could have been the wind, but I knew better. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. Then, another tap, louder this time. I turned my head slowly, and through the small gap in the curtain, I saw her, the same woman, standing just outside the window, closer this time. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there. I gripped the handle of the axe I had brought inside earlier that day, my pulse hammering. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Me sitting inside, barely moving, and her standing outside, staring. Then, just as suddenly as before, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, she was gone. The footprints were there again, leading up to the window and then back into the woods. I didn't stick around to find out more. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and left. I never told my friend the full story. I just said the place made me uneasy, that I didn't feel comfortable staying there. I don't know who she was. I don't know what she wanted, but I know I never want to see her again. I never had a reason to drive out that far. The only thing past those old dirt roads were a few scattered farms, abandoned buildings, and the town's cemetery. No one really went out there unless they had to. But when I found myself in need of a quiet place to stay for a while, the old cabin by the graveyard became my only option. It wasn't my first choice. It wasn't even my 10th. But life had a way of forcing people into places they'd rather avoid. It all started when my job let me go. I had worked for a small construction company that mostly handled remodeling jobs around town. Nothing major, just fixing up old houses, patching up roofs, pouring concrete for driveways. It paid well enough to cover rent, food, and whatever was left went to savings. But work slowed down. Then it stopped. One morning, I got a call from my boss saying he couldn't keep paying me. That was it. I wasn't special. I wasn't the only one. First, I thought I'd find another job fast. But weeks passed, then months, and nothing came through. Money drained faster than I expected. I cut back on everything, but it wasn't enough. My landlord gave me 2 weeks to pay up or leave. I had no way to pay. That's when I remembered the cabin. It belonged to my uncle. He died a few years back, and no one in the family cared enough to do anything with the place. It was too far, too run down, and too close to the cemetery. It had always been a strange place. I only went there once when I was a kid, and even then, I remember feeling like I wasn't supposed to be there. My uncle never had visitors, and the cabin itself was little more than a wooden box in the woods. But I needed somewhere to stay, and it was free. I packed up what little I had, threw everything into my old truck, and drove out there one evening. The closer I got, the more I questioned my decision. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. Trees pressed in from both sides. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over everything. I hadn't been out there in years, but the place hadn't changed at all. The graveyard sat just off the road, behind a rusted iron fence. The headstones were old, some leaning, some covered in moss. The cabin sat a little further up, hidden in the trees. It was just as bad as I remembered. The wood was gray and splintered. The windows were dirty. The door hung slightly off-center. The whole thing looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But it was shelter. It was free. I parked, grabbed my bag, and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and rot. The inside was one large room with a fireplace on one side and a small kitchen area on the other. The bed was just a wooden frame with a rotting mattress. A single chair sat near the fireplace. A workbench lined the back wall, covered in old tools and rusted junk. It wasn't comfortable, but it would have to do. The first few nights were fine. I cleaned up, patched the worst of the holes, and settled in. I spent my days looking for work, driving back into town, filling out applications, making calls. Nothing ever came through. At night, I stayed inside, trying to ignore the sounds outside. The woods made noise. Twigs snapped. Leaves rustled. Sometimes I heard animals moving around. But sometimes it was different. Started small. One night I heard footsteps outside. Slow, uneven, like someone walking with a limp. I sat still, listening. The footsteps stopped near the front door. I waited, heart pounding. Nothing happened. After a while, I convinced myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Then the next night, I heard it again. Same slow, dragging steps. This time, they circled the cabin. The floor creaked beneath me as I shifted, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. It was worse than if something had. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from rain, and I expected to see tracks. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No signs of anything moving through. That's when I started locking the door at night. Days passed and things got stranger. One evening, as the sun was setting, I went outside to bring in some firewood. As I bent down to grab a log, I noticed something in the distance. A figure, standing near the graveyard. Not moving, just standing there. I froze. It was too far to make out details. The sun was low, and the shadows stretched long. But it was a person. I was sure of it. I stood there for a long time, watching. The figure never moved. Eventually, the light faded, and I went inside. That night, the footsteps came back. Closer this time. They stopped right outside my window. I sat up in bed, staring at the wall, too afraid to move. Then came the worst part. A sound. A slow, dragging breath. I gripped the blanket, holding my breath, waiting. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. I barely slept after that. The next day, I tried to focus on anything else. I chopped wood, fixed the broken door hinge. But every time I looked toward the graveyard, I felt it. That weight, like I was being watched. That night, I decided to be ready. I kept a hammer next to me, and I stayed awake, listening. Hours passed. The wind howled through the trees. The fire crackled in the hearth. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I gripped the hammer, my pulse hammering in my ears, then scraping, like nails dragging against the wood. I couldn't move. Then silence. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. By morning, I was done. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't staying to find out. I packed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and started the engine. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. A figure stood at the tree line, watching. I didn't wait. I drove. Fast. I never went back. I never asked questions. I left the cabin, the graveyard, and whatever was out there behind. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some places are better left alone. And whatever was watching me in that graveyard knew that better than I did. I never expected to find myself alone in a remote French cabin in the middle of winter. It was supposed to be a peaceful break, a chance to escape the noise of everyday life and get some work done. I rented a small cabin in the Vosges Mountains, deep in the forest, far from any towns or villages. The idea was to spend 2 weeks in solitude, hiking during the day and writing at night. No distractions, no responsibilities, just quiet. The cabin was an old wooden structure, built decades ago, with a steep roof to keep snow from piling up too much. The walls were thick, the windows small. Inside, it was simple: one main room with a wood stove, a table, a small kitchenette, and a single bedroom. The bathroom was an outhouse a short walk away, which I already knew would be a pain in the freezing temperatures. But I liked the idea of being away from everything. No internet, no phone signal, just the trees, the wind, and the sound of my own breathing. The first couple of days went exactly as planned. I hiked through the forest, followed small trails that led nowhere, enjoyed the silence. The weather was cold but clear, and I felt good. At night, I wrote in my journal, read books by candlelight, and let the wood stove fill the cabin with warmth. There was something peaceful about being so far removed from the rest of the world. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside, a soft, rhythmic crunching, footsteps in the snow. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe just snow shifting on the roof. But as I lay there, listening, the sound became clearer. Slow steps moving through the trees, stopping, then starting again. I sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps didn't seem to be coming toward the cabin. They circled, pausing now and then. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, crept to the small window. The forest outside was a blur of darkness and shifting shadows. I saw nothing, but I felt it, that deep, unmistakable feeling of being watched. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps faded away. Then, after a long time, I forced myself back into bed. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer, maybe, or a fox, something wandering through the snow. But in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I went outside to check. The snow was fresh, untouched except for my own footprints from the day before. No animal tracks, no signs of anything passing by in the night. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were slower, closer. I sat by the window in the dark, waiting, barely breathing. I had no weapon, nothing to protect myself with except a kitchen knife. I told myself again that it was just an animal, but deep down I knew this wasn't an animal. I barely slept. The next morning, I found something new in the snow. Footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin. I stood there, staring at them, my breath clouding in the cold air. They were fresh, clear in the morning light. Someone had walked around my cabin in the night, more than once. They had stopped at the windows, the door. I packed my bag. I told myself I would leave. But as the day stretched on, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost. Maybe it was nothing. The rental agreement said someone came by every few days to check on the cabin. Maybe it was them, so I stayed. That night, the footsteps returned. But this time, they didn't stop outside. I heard the doorknob rattle. I was frozen in place. I had locked the door, but the idea of someone trying to get in made my stomach drop. I grabbed the kitchen knife, stood in the middle of the room, listening. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, soft, deliberate footsteps moving toward the window. I didn't move. The candle on the table flickered, casting shifting shadows. I didn't look at the window. I didn't want to see. The footsteps faded after a while, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep at all. Morning came slowly, and when I stepped outside, I saw the tracks again. They were deeper this time, closer. Whoever it was had stood at my door for a long time. I left that morning. I hiked back to where I had parked my car, heart hammering the whole way. The footprints followed me for a while, then disappeared into the trees. I never saw who it was. I never went back. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I checked the news for any reports in the area. Nothing. No break-ins, no missing persons, no crimes. Just an empty stretch of woods. But I know what I heard, and I know that I wasn't alone in that cabin. I never thought I'd inherit anything in my life. I grew up knowing that the only things I could count on were the ones I earned myself. So, when I got a letter in the mail telling me my uncle had left me his old farm cabin, I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen him in years. He was my mom's older brother, a quiet man who kept to himself, the kind of guy who never visited for holidays, never called, never really let anyone know what was going on in his life. My mom used to tell me stories about him when I was a kid, how he was always a little different from the rest of the family, how he left home young, bought that farm, and never looked back. I had my own life in the city. I worked a job that kept me busy, lived in a small apartment, and didn't think about family much. But curiosity got the better of me. The farm was in a quiet town in Montana, a place I had only visited once when I was little. The cabin sat in the middle of a massive stretch of land, surrounded by miles of open fields, thick patches of woods, and nothing else. It had been years since anyone had lived there, and the lawyer handling my uncle's estate told me it had been sitting empty since he passed. I drove out there alone. It was late autumn, and the weather had started to turn cold. The air smelled like damp leaves and soil when I stepped out of my truck. The place looked just like I remembered, worn, weathered, but still standing strong. A 2-story log cabin with a wraparound porch, set back against the tree line at the edge of the property. The fields stretched out in every direction, golden and dry, rustling in the breeze. There was a barn a few hundred yards away, the roof slightly caved in on one side. The inside of the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. It was freezing, the kind of deep cold that settles into a place when it hasn't been lived in for years. The furniture was still there, covered in white sheets. The kitchen was simple. Wooden cabinets, an old fridge, a stove that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. There was a staircase leading up to a small loft-style second floor, where my uncle had apparently slept. I started going through the place, checking things out, trying to decide if I was going to keep it or sell it. The thought of moving out here didn't seem realistic. I wasn't a farm guy. I didn't know the first thing about maintaining land or fixing up a place like this. But there was something about it that made me want to stay, at least for a little while. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the fact that I had nothing waiting for me back in the city. I spent my first night there without much issue. I had brought enough supplies to last me a few weeks: canned food, bottled water, a generator for power. The nights were colder than I expected, and I had to keep a fire going just to stay warm. The wind outside was relentless, howling through the trees, making the old walls creak. I barely slept. The second day, I started exploring the land. My uncle's property stretched out for miles, a mix of overgrown fields and dense woods. There were signs that he had tried to keep it maintained. Old, rusted farming equipment sitting in the barn, trails through the trees that had been worn down by years of use. I found an old well near the back of the cabin, covered by a wooden lid. I checked it out, but the water inside looked dark and undrinkable. Then I found something that made my stomach turn. At the very back of the property, past a thick patch of trees, I came across a clearing. The ground there was disturbed, the dirt freshly turned over in spots. It wasn't just one spot. It was several, lined up in uneven rows. The earth was packed down in some places, loose in others, as if someone had been digging there recently. It looked like graves. I told myself it had to be something else. Maybe my uncle had buried trash out here or old farming materials. Maybe it was nothing, but it didn't sit right with me. The more I stared at the uneven ground, the more unsettled I felt. That night, I barely slept again. The wind had died down, but the silence was worse. It was too quiet, too empty. Every little sound made me sit up, my heart pounding. At some point in the night, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, my breath stuck in my throat. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like the porch steps shifting under weight. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When I finally got the courage to check outside, I didn't see anything. But the dirt in front of the porch looked different, like someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. I didn't go back to the clearing that day. I didn't want to, but my mind kept going back to it, to those disturbed patches of earth. I told myself I needed to know. By the third day, I had made up my mind I was going to dig one up. I waited until the afternoon, when the sun was at its highest. I grabbed a shovel from the barn and walked back through the trees, my stomach tight. The air felt heavier there, thick and still. I picked the smallest mound and started digging. It didn't take long. The soil was loose, easy to move. A few feet down, my shovel hit something solid. It was a wooden box, small, rotting, the lid barely held together. I hesitated, then pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a dirty cloth, was a set of bones. Human bones. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my hands shaking. My uncle had buried someone out here, maybe more than one person. I looked around at the other mounds, my stomach churning. How many bodies were here? I didn't know what to do. Call the cops? Drive back to town? I wasn't even sure I had cell service out here. My hands were still shaking when I heard it. Footsteps. Not far. Coming through the trees. Someone was out here with me. I dropped the shovel and ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside the cabin. The door locked behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I grabbed my keys, ready to leave, but then I heard it. The porch steps creaking. Someone was standing outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The cabin was dead silent, except for the faint sound of breathing. Not mine. Then, slowly, carefully, whoever was outside tried the doorknob. I grabbed my gun from my bag, my hands still shaking. I didn't know if I had the nerve to use it. I didn't know if I needed to, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I stood there for what felt like hours, gun in hand, waiting, but the knob never turned again. The breathing stopped. The footsteps faded. When the sun finally rose, I ran to my truck and left everything behind. I never went back. I sold the land as soon as I could. I didn't tell anyone what I found. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have called the cops, told them about the graves. But some things are better left alone. Some things are buried for a reason, and I wasn't about to be the next one. I had been driving that same road for years, but something about that night felt off from the moment I left town. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was exhausted from working overtime. My boss owned a cabin deep in the woods, not far from the main road I always took to get home. It was a place I'd seen plenty of times, especially during the day, but at night, it looked completely different. The trees pressed in, swallowing the light from my headlights, and the deeper I got into the forest, the more I felt like something was watching me. The road was empty, just me and the endless stretch of cracked asphalt. I kept my eyes on the lines, trying to ignore the way the trees swayed in the wind. I'd heard stories before, things people claimed to see in the woods, strange figures, animals that didn't look right, but I never believed in any of that. It was just a bunch of nonsense people told each other to make the night feel worse than it already was. Still, that feeling wouldn't go away. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense that something was wrong. As I approached the turn near my boss's cabin, I noticed something unusual. Normally, the place was dark at this hour, no reason for anyone to be up that late in the middle of nowhere. But that night, I saw lights through the trees. The glow was faint, barely there, but enough to make me slow down. At first, I figured maybe my boss had come up for the weekend, or maybe one of his family members was staying there. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. The lights weren't steady like lamps or a fire. They flickered, moving through the trees like someone was carrying them. I felt my grip tighten on the steering wheel. The logical side of my brain told me to keep driving. It wasn't my problem, and I was too tired to care about whatever was going on back there. But something about it bothered me. I eased off the gas, just enough to slow down as I passed the dirt road leading to the cabin. The headlights barely reached past the first few trees, but for a second, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting between the trunks like people walking. I stared for too long, trying to make sense of it, and before I knew it, I had almost stopped completely in the middle of the road. That was a mistake. The moment I realized I had stopped, my stomach twisted. It was that primal feeling, the one that tells you you've done something wrong. I pressed my foot on the gas, forcing myself to pick up speed. I told myself I was being stupid, that there was a reasonable explanation for everything. But then I looked in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just my taillights reflecting against the trees. But the more I looked, the more I realized something was moving behind me. A shape, barely visible in the red glow, standing at the entrance of the dirt road. I didn't slow down again. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the road, forcing myself not to look back. The drive felt longer than usual. My hands were slick against the steering wheel, and my breath was coming too fast, too uneven. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then my headlights caught something up ahead. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a coyote, but it wasn't moving like one. It was standing on the side of the road, just outside the reach of my high beams. My foot hovered over the brake, but I didn't press it. As I got closer, I saw what it really was. A man. He was standing completely still, facing the road. His clothes were dark, blending into the night, but I could make out the shape of him. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't moving at all. He was just there. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I forced myself to keep going, my pulse hammering in my ears. As I passed him, I made the mistake of looking at his face, or at least where his face should have been. I couldn't make out any features, just a pale blur where his skin should be. I didn't look again. I kept driving, forcing myself not to check the mirror, not to think about the way he had been standing there, perfectly still. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I don't remember pulling into my driveway. I don't remember turning off the engine. I just remember sitting in the car for a long time, gripping the wheel, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I thought I had. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Even after I locked my doors, after I checked every window in my house, after I forced myself into bed, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had been watching me. I didn't take that road again for a while. I found another way home, a longer route, but one that didn't pass by the cabin. A week later, I heard that someone had broken into my boss's cabin. There wasn't much damage, nothing was stolen, but the door had been left wide open, like someone had been inside and then just walked away. They never found out who did it. I never told anyone what I saw that night, and I never passed that cabin again after dark. I had been working for a small logging company in northern Montana for about 6 years when the job offer came in. It was a simple one: watch over a remote logging cabin for a couple of nights while a new shipment of equipment was being delivered. The company didn't want to risk theft, even though we were so deep in the woods that it seemed like no one else would bother coming out there. Still, they insisted someone stay behind, and I was the unlucky one who had to do it. The cabin sat about 15 miles off the main road, a rough drive through thick woods with nothing but towering pines in every direction. It was an old structure, built sometime in the 1960s, and had been used on and off by different crews over the years. Inside, it was basic: 2 rooms, a cot, a small stove, a table, and some shelves. No running water, just a pump outside. No electricity except for a small generator that we only turned on when necessary. I packed enough supplies for the 2 nights: canned food, a jug of water, my flashlight, and my rifle. The company provided a radio for emergencies, though it only worked when the signal was clear, which wasn't always the case this far out. I arrived just before sunset. The air smelled of damp pine, and the ground was still wet from the rain earlier that week. The sky had started turning dark as the sun dipped behind the trees. I parked the truck a few feet from the cabin and took my gear inside. Everything seemed normal at first. The cabin was the same as it had always been, musty and cold, with a draft coming through the gaps in the walls. The only odd thing was that the door had been unlocked when I got there. We usually kept it padlocked when no one was around, but I figured maybe the last guy forgot. I set up for the night, made a small fire in the stove, and had some canned chili. The wind outside picked up, making the trees creak. I'd always found the woods peaceful at night, even if it was eerily quiet. But as I lay in the cot, trying to sleep, I felt off, like something wasn't right. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't uncommon to feel uneasy when you were out here alone. Every little sound seemed louder, and the dark pressed in from all sides. I told myself it was just another job, and by morning, I'd laugh at my own paranoia. But then I heard something, a noise faint at first, a branch snapping somewhere outside. I sat up in the cot, listening. The wind had died down, and now the only sounds were the occasional groans of the old cabin settling and the distant rustling of the trees. I reached for my flashlight and rifle just in case. A few seconds passed. Then another snap. Closer this time. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. I got up, careful to move quietly. I turned off the lantern and crept to the window. It was too dark to see much, just the faint outline of trees against the night sky. I listened, heart pounding. Silence. Maybe an animal, I thought. A deer, maybe. Or a raccoon. I waited another minute. Nothing. I decided to check outside. I slipped on my boots, grabbed the rifle, and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, cutting through my flannel. The air was still, too still. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but wet leaves and the muddy trail leading back to the truck. I moved the light toward the trees. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Deep, fresh footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. I turned quickly, scanning the area. My skin crawled as I followed the prints with my light. They came from the tree line and led right up to the porch, right up to where I was standing. Someone had been here. I swung the light around wildly, my pulse hammering. I strained my ears for any movement, but the woods had gone completely silent. Then, from behind me inside the cabin, a creak. I spun around, aiming my rifle at the open doorway. The cabin was dark now, my lantern still off. I knew, without a doubt, I had locked that door behind me. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the mud, my breath coming fast. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, pushed it open. The cabin was empty, or at least it looked empty. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my finger tight on the trigger. The cot was undisturbed. The shelves looked the same. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. But something was different. The scent. There was a smell now, faint but unmistakable. A mix of damp earth and sweat. Someone had been inside, and they could still be here. I stepped inside slowly, my boots barely making a sound. I swept the flashlight toward the back of the room, where an old wooden closet stood against the wall. The door was slightly open. That door had been closed when I left. I swallowed hard, raising the rifle. I took one step closer. The floor creaked beneath me. Then the closet door moved, just an inch, but enough. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open and stepped back. Empty. Just some old coats hanging, a few dusty boxes. My heart was pounding in my ears. I was starting to feel like I was losing it. But then I noticed something. The coats were swaying slightly, like someone had just been there. I backed away, breathing hard. I needed to get out, get to the truck, drive out of here now. I turned and grabbed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder. My rifle stayed in my other hand. As I reached the door, something caught my eye. The footprints. There was another set now, leading away from the cabin. I stepped out onto the porch, flashlight scanning the ground. Whoever had been inside was now out there, watching, waiting. I felt my stomach drop. I moved fast. I sprinted to the truck, fumbling with the keys. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. My breath fogged up the windshield as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I slammed the wheel, panic setting in. Then I saw movement, just beyond the trees where the headlights barely reached. A figure, tall, still, watching me. I tried the ignition again. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. I didn't think. I hit the gas. Mud flew as the truck lurched forward, bouncing over the rough ground. My headlights cut through the trees, and in that brief moment, I saw him clearly. A man, standing just at the edge of the woods, wearing a dark jacket, face hidden in the shadows. I sped down the trail, my heart hammering. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. When I finally reached town, I reported everything. The sheriff and a couple of deputies drove out the next morning. They found the cabin door open, footprints in the mud, but no sign of the man. I never took another night shift out there again. And to this day, I wonder how long he had been inside that cabin before I even knew he was there. It was 2013 when I decided to take a break from everything. Life had gotten too noisy. Phones ringing, emails piling up, and people constantly needing something from me. I had spent the last 6 years grinding away at a job that barely gave me time to breathe. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and most of my friends had drifted away over the years. So, when an old friend mentioned he had a cabin up in northern Montana that he wasn't using, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was isolated, deep in the woods, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest real town. It wasn't some fancy lodge, just a small, sturdy wooden cabin with a single bedroom, a living area, and a tiny kitchen. No TV, no internet, and barely any cell service. Just trees, quiet, and a stocked pantry. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sky was starting to darken. The drive had been long, winding through miles of dirt roads, with barely a sign of civilization. By the time I pulled up, the air had turned cold, and the trees swayed in the wind. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost unnatural. The kind of quiet that you don't get in the city, the kind where even the wind sounds too loud. I carried my bags inside, set up my sleeping bag on the old mattress, and got a fire going in the wood stove. The cabin had no electricity, just a few old gas lamps and a pile of split logs stacked against the wall. I sat down in the worn-out armchair near the stove, staring into the flames, letting my mind go blank for the first time in years. That first night, I woke up to a sound outside. A branch snapping, maybe, or something moving through the underbrush. I was a heavy sleeper, always had been, but something about the noise pulled me awake immediately. I lay there, listening, trying to decide if it was just my imagination. There was nothing for a while, just the wind, then another sound, a faint crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. I hadn't seen another car for miles when I drove in. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought and shined it through the window. The beam caught nothing but trees, their bare branches shifting in the wind. I waited, straining to hear anything else, but the night was quiet again. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A deer, maybe, or a coyote. I had read somewhere that bears sometimes wandered through this area, but I hadn't seen any signs of one. Still, I kept the flashlight next to me as I lay back down, my ears still tuned to every small noise outside. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to take a look around. The air was crisp, the ground damp from the night's frost. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground for tracks. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the normal scatter of fallen leaves and twigs. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks, footprints. Human. They weren't mine. I had been careful walking up to the cabin the night before, and these were fresh. The pattern in the dirt was different from my boots, the prints spaced in a way that suggested slow, deliberate steps. They led from the tree line toward the cabin, stopping a few feet from the porch before turning back. Someone had been here last night. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I scanned the woods, my eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing, just the same quiet emptiness. I told myself it had to be a hunter, maybe someone passing through, curious about the cabin. But why would they come this close and then leave? Why not knock or call out? I went back inside, locking the door behind me even though I knew it wouldn't do much. The cabin's lock was old, barely more than a latch. If someone wanted in, they wouldn't have much trouble. I spent most of the day inside, listening. The wind, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Every little noise made my skin crawl. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the flashlight in my hand, listening. The hours passed slowly, the fire in the stove dying down to embers. At some point, exhaustion caught up to me, and I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of something knocking against the cabin. It was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a bolt of fear straight through me. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. Something was standing outside, tapping on the glass. I forced myself to turn my head, just enough to glance at the window. The cabin was dark, and the night outside was even darker, but I could see the faint outline of something standing just beyond the glass. tall, motionless. I gripped the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam hit the window, lighting up nothing but empty space. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and grabbed my bag. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I wasn't staying here. I threw on my boots, shoved everything important into my pack, and grabbed the keys to my truck. I swung the door open and froze. The footprints were back, dozens of them, leading from the woods to my window. I ran to the truck, fumbling with the keys, shoving them into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into reverse, tearing out of the clearing so fast that dirt and gravel sprayed behind me. I didn't stop, not once. It was nearly dawn when I finally reached the main road. The sky was beginning to lighten, the world starting to feel real again. I drove straight to the nearest town, found the first motel I could, and locked myself inside. I never went back to that cabin. A few days later, I called my friend and told him what happened. He sounded surprised, said no one had ever mentioned anything like that before. He offered to go check it out, but I told him not to bother. I didn't need to know. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted. All I know is that someone was watching me, and they were close, too close. I don't go out to places like that anymore. I don't go anywhere that far from other people. I used to think I liked the quiet, but now I know better. The quiet is when you realize you're not alone.